Good evening, everyone. Friends and colleagues, my name is Alexander Cooley, and I have the current great privilege of being the director of the Harriman Institute here at Columbia University. On behalf of the Harriman Institute, the Ukrainian Studies Program, the Department of History, I would like to welcome you to today's tribute that celebrates and remembers the remarkable intellectual contributions and friendship of Professor Mark von Hagen. On the Columbia faculty from 1985 to 2007, when he left Columbia for Arizona State University, he served as director of the Harriman Institute from 1995 to 2001. Mark literally led the Harriman Institute into the 21st centuries. His achievements and legacies are numerous, as we will hear today, and as our panelists and audience will explain much better than me. But I would like to note just three. One, his scholarship redefined what our region was about and encouraged us to reorient away from imperial centers to so-called peripheries. He highlighted the importance of borderlands, comparative imperial study and collapse, migration, and hidden historical experiences, even before such terms became accepted as mainstream and, dare I say, academically fashionable. Mark also had the vision to realize that Ukrainian studies was an important field of study in its own right, and he had a vision that it should be built up here at Columbia and under Harriman. He was responsible for fundraising and establishing the program as we know it today. And third, he was instrumental in the development of our own program here in regional studies. He founded a signature course, Legacies of the Soviet Union, where he realized very early on that this turn to sort of post-communist study itself necessitated its own set of courses and topics and themes. And appropriately enough, today, our students continue to read Mark's path-breaking articles, and they continue to learn about his contributions to the Institute and the field more broadly. The breadth of Mark's scholarly accomplishments and expertise is easily summed up by the fact that he served as president of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, president of the International Association for Ukrainian Studies, and dean of the philosophy faculty with the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, Germany. But beyond all of these academic achievements, he was also incredibly kind, curious, and generous. When he left in 2007 for Arizona State University, he held the title of Bakhmetov Professor of Russian and East European Culture and was chair of the Columbia History Department. At ASU, he held a plethora of titles and appointments, but he was particularly proud of being the founding director of the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement at ASU, returning to his roots as military historian. Fortunately for us, Mark also returned to New York and Harriman frequently. Tonight, we are so grateful to welcome a number of speakers, colleagues, scholars, students, and friends to reflect on Mark's intellect, his inspiration, his warmth, his sheer humanity. And we are especially grateful that Mark's spouse, Johnny Roldan-Chacon, has joined us as well. Thank you, Johnny. So in our order of speakers today, Professor Michael David Fox from Georgetown University, Professor Maria Sonevytsky from now California, Berkeley, Professor Laurie Manchester from Arizona State University, Professor Frank Sysyn from the University of Alberta, Professor Richard Wortman from Columbia University, and Professor Elizabeth Valkenier from Columbia. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, then we'll open the floor to questions, memories, and invite anyone who has something to share from the audience to do so. Just a reminder that we are filming and archiving this for our current and future communities. And I would propose that for this occasion, just as Mark always insisted in his way to put everyone at ease, we'll just call each other by our first names. Thank you, Michael.
I'd like to take you back to a time just before the Soviet Union entered its final period of ferment and collapse. In January 1985, a tall, handsome, newly minted PhD from Stanford arrived here at Columbia to take up the position as assistant professor of Soviet history. At the beginning of this period that I'm talking about, our field, Russian Soviet history, was still caught up in highly politicized, increasingly fruitless, I would say, gladiatorial debates between totalitarians and revisionists, but soon enough, the archival revolution was turning into a veritable gold rush, and the linguistic turn was shaking up everything we thought we knew. Each of those phenomena, the politicization, the gold rush, and for lack of a better term, French theory, had its excesses that generated more heat than light. And there enters the Mark von Hagen that I remember so well. He was energetic and engaged and enthusiastic, but also judicious, grounded, savvy, and perhaps above all, diplomatic. Mark's position here at Columbia was challenging, to say the least. He was taking the position that had been vacated when Sheila Fitzpatrick was forced to leave for Texas in 1980, and the two giants who dominated the field, Leopold Haemsen and Mark Ryoff, how shall I put it, they did not get along too well, and a small army of rather arrogant, not infrequently aggressive, iconoclastic, and also very needy graduate students besieged Mark from all sides. As an assistant professor of what was then the epicenter of the field of Russian-Soviet history, he was thrust into a maelstrom of competing demands. And it was at this rather extraordinary time, both in the field and the region that we study, that I first met Mark. He came to Columbia in my first year of graduate school at Yale. He came to Yale to teach a course in Soviet history. This was in January 1987, so 32 years ago. It's in no small part because of that experience that I took courses here at Columbia with him and others on some sort of Ivy League exchange program that there was. And then I took a postdoc here at the Harriman Institute. Mark was on my orals and dissertation committee. He, in general, played a very big role in my entry into the field. And thinking back, I found him to be unpretentious and yet worldly. He was knowledgeable and savvy. He was open to new directions and new ideas. And looking back, I see how he epitomized grace under pressure. His students often, and I speak for myself too, unknowingly sometimes and self-centeredly demanded a great deal from him. And yet when I was around him, I remember he always exuded a kind of warm, slightly ironical good cheer. He made it clear that he cared quite a bit about the people who surrounded him and came into contact with him, and that was true really his whole life, as long as he lived. And this is by way of suggesting that one major way that Mark helped transform the field of 20th century Russian-Soviet history was to shape, as a teacher, the first post-Soviet generation of historians. And this, as I was saying, started immediately in 1985, long before he published his first book, Soldiers in the Proletarian Dictatorship, on the Red Army and the Soviet State, which came out in 1990. In 1993, Mark published an article in the Slavic Review called The Archival Gold Rush and Historical Agendas in the Post-Soviet Era. It was important for us at the time to critically look at the sources. It said a lot of things we were thinking, but went beyond them in many ways. This was one of the very first of a long series of hard-hitting and provocative think pieces, all of them with very pithy and captivating titles, which kind of encapsulated what he wanted to say. And these masterful short, he was a master of the short genre, and these masterful short pieces, I think, epitomize how Mark was skeptical and not infrequently directly critical of the extremes of anti-communism and revisionism in the field at the extremes, but his centrism was not one of a kind of split the difference variety. It was an innovative, creative, dare I say, radical middle. His criticisms, I think, and I've had occasion to look back fairly recently, his criticisms of some works really have stood the test of time. So this is a second way that Mark helped transform the field through a lengthy series of seminal articles and chapters that were works of reconceptualization. His very first foray into Ukrainian history was entitled, Does Ukraine Have a History? It ruffled a lot of feathers, but it demonstrated a cosmopolitan, integrative approach to national history that only deepened as I think he did something quite bold at the time. He retooled as a Ukrainian historian, as a Ukrainianist, and at the same time, as he liked to put it later, he took the imperial turn. So it's very clear to me that the way he was shifting paradigms was achieved not by sort of tearing things down or not by some kind of flash in the pan innovation, but by what I would call a scholarship of integration. For example, his classic variations on the genre of seminal think piece. And these are things that influenced really a whole generation of people, writing the history of Russia as empire, the AHR article, Empires, Borderlands, and Diasporas, Eurasia as anti-paradigm for the post-Soviet era. These were at the same time addressed to Russian historians and Ukrainian historians, and the history of Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union writ large. He also then integrated the military and frontier borderlands history that he first grappled with starting in Soldiers in the Proletarian Dictatorship. And that came into his work, this military and international and borderlands regional dimension really came into play in his work on the Ukrainian, what he called the Ukrainian Revolution, and the entire period 1914 to 1921, which he was working on for several years before he left us far too soon. So for some time leading up to his passing, he was in the process of reconceptualizing this era along a series of relationships or axes that I think gave his work, the work that he sent me in recent years, really a novel feel. He was integrating the social and the political, the social and the national, the political and the military, the international and the regional dimensions, the state and a range of potential failed and incipient states within a kaleidoscope of borderland movements arising out of the implosion of the Tsarist Empire. There's no question from the works that I looked at that he sent me that he was leading up to a revision of grand narratives, and again, in an integrative, judicious, and yet bold way. And so it is a shame that Mark left us without leaving behind a completed work, but he left many signposts for others to follow. I was writing the obituary for Georgetown University because he was a 1976 graduate of the School of Foreign Service. He graduated summa cum laude. He went into Russian, he was probably one of our most distinguished graduates in the field of Russian and Soviet studies in general, and that's saying something. But I found a number of autobiographical sources, and I found that he was, very self-reflexive, both as a person and as a historian, and especially what impressed me was his talk for the oral history that he did for the Harriman Institute Oral History Project, which, if you haven't read, it's easily available online, and it's extremely interesting. And in that interview, he had much to say about his days in the School of Foreign Service as an undergraduate. He talked about his experiences as a closeted gay man at a Jesuit university, covering an incipient gay rights movement for the student newspaper, The Hoya, and abandoning his original plan to go into diplomatic or intelligence work for fear that he would later be discovered at that time. And the world of historical scholarship, the world of academia, was the beneficiary, but Mark always remained deeply grounded in current affairs and international politics. He also had a real service ethic throughout his life, and time again he set aside his own personal work and professional agenda to do many significant things meaningful for him and for others. For example, what Alex already mentioned, becoming a director of the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement at Arizona State, which had a major impact on the lives of student veterans. So I will always think of Mark as a warm and engaging and kind and interesting man, as an influential teacher to me and to many others, as one of the most discerning American experts on Russia and Ukraine, and as a great scholar in the field of Russian, Soviet, and Eurasian studies. Mark, we will miss you and we will always remember you.
Hello, my name is Maria Sonevytsky. I'm a professor of ethnomusicology at Berkeley, and I'm armed, quite literally here, with a handkerchief in case I can't make it to the end. So thank you, Corinna, for that very appropriate handkerchief. It has tanks on it. I have been at a loss for words, thinking about what to say about Professor Mark von Hagen. He, Marco, was so many things to me. He was a mentor, a trusted friend, a scholar of and legitimizing presence for Ukrainian studies, an advocate for veterans in higher education, and, not to be forgotten, a quite accomplished accordionist. And so I'll assert my prerogative as a professor of ethnomusicology and begin from the accordion. In 2005, I interviewed Mark for my master's thesis in ethnomusicology. The interview was about his relationship to the instrument, which he had learned as a child, starting at the age of 8 when his family was stationed near Trier, Germany. He carried his accordion through high school in Colorado, college at Georgetown University, and graduate school in Bloomington and later Stanford. He told me about serenading the emeritus faculty at Stanford's faculty house on his accordion, a weekly gig that supplemented his modest stipend as a doctoral student in history. Many of these emerita faculty were Central Europeans, and Mark described how his repertoire seemed to activate a nostalgia that triggered both tears and tips. Eventually, he brought his accordion along to Columbia University. By the time of our 2005 interview, he told me that he was dusting it off only once a year for the Harriman Institute Winter Solstice Party, or whatever it was called. And for a few memorable years, roughly 2004 to 2007, I accompanied him at those parties on my own accordion. Yes, we sight-read songs from his old songbooks as a faithful crowd of listeners, usually emboldened by vodka, encircled us, requesting songs and singing along, while another group of partygoers escaped into the next room, not so discreetly distancing themselves from the sound of our dueling squeeze boxes. Mark's identity as an accordionist, he told me, in his characteristically soft-spoken but self-assured way, was probably understood as one of his several eccentricities by colleagues at Columbia. But the accordion served an intellectual purpose for him as well. He told me that he identified with Slavic culture through the accordion. On that instrument, he learned the sentimental Soviet film songs, the hymns, and the Russian hits, but he also grew an appreciation for musics of other territories. The accordion steered him, he told me, to his first Ukrainian hopak. Is it too much to say that Mark, as accordionist, his identification with an underdog instrument, his vast repertoire of unusual songs for an American to know, his willingness to introduce a slightly subversive oompa into the most hallowed of halls, his refusal to take himself too seriously, can this tell us a lot about Mark perhaps in other capacities. Certainly some of his most winning personal attributes are captured, I think, in this lifelong relationship to the instrument: dedication, humility, an expansive sense of the world, a capacity for generosity as natural as breath, like the constantly reanimating bellows of an accordion. So I'll turn now to Mark the Ukrainianist. I met Professor Mark von Hagen when I was an undergraduate, at the time that I had nearly completed my undergraduate double major in music and what we then called Slavic Regional Studies. As a student who had transferred from an obscure commuter school late in my undergraduate career, I carried some feelings of being an imposter around with me here at Columbia. At first glance, Mark was quite intimidating. He was the positive vision of a Columbia professor, erudite, dignified, confident. But when he asked me what I was working on, he transformed, suddenly a fellow student, disarmingly curious, gentle but precise with his questions. He went on to help steer my undergraduate honors thesis, and in that last year of my BA, he attended my piano recitals, introduced me to Johnny, and fully entered my life as a mentor who seemed to see something in me that I didn't know was there. I had the privilege, after graduating, to work side by side with Mark in building up the Ukrainian Studies program here at Columbia. Though I was almost certainly not qualified for the job, Mark entrusted me with it, and we worked with a team of community members and scholars to organize a large fundraiser for Ukrainian Studies here at Columbia. Later that year, I accompanied him to Donetsk to the International Association of Ukrainianists conference while he was president of that society. It was these experiences that first awoke me to the political stakes of knowledge production and institution building on both local and international scales. What did it mean to sanction a topic of study by providing it a home in the academy? Why did the institutional terrain appear so uneven for the study of marginalized territories of the world in comparison to former empires or Western European nation states? Frank Sysyn will surely fill us in on some of the details of how Mark came to Ukrainian subjects, and Yaroslav Hrycak has recently published an appraisal of his trajectory as a conscious Ukrainianist in the pages of Ab Imperio. But I want to linger for a moment on what his choice to study Ukrainian history after Soviet military history, to select Ukraine and Ukrainian historiography as an object of study, meant symbolically for me, and I suspect for many members of the Ukrainian American community. To center a territory that was frequently dismissed as too peripheral, its history viewed as either illegitimate or overly politicized, and to take it up with rigor, with care and critical distance, signaled to me the possibility of a post-Soviet studies decoupled from the dominant, yet frequently unmarked Russocentrism of Cold War Sovietology in the West. His 1995 Slavic Review article, already mentioned, Does Ukraine Have a History?, demonstrated in virtuosic fashion that Ukrainian history could be something beyond, as he put it, the searching for roots, national advocacy, or partisan pleading that mainstream historians had depicted it to be. Not only that, but Mark concluded this article by making a powerful case that, quote, the study of Ukrainian history was intrinsically interesting precisely because it challenged so many cliches of the nation-state paradigm. He went on from there to write, Ukrainian history can serve as a wonderful vehicle to challenge the nation-state's conceptual hegemony and to explore some of the most contested issues of identity formation, cultural construction and maintenance, and colonial institutions and structures, end quote. Indeed, Ukraine never fails to present these challenges. The questions advanced in this 1995 call for scholarly inquiry reverberate throughout contemporary work on Ukraine in history, anthropology, and even music studies a quarter century later. I would assert, in fact, that Mark's impact on my home discipline of ethnomusicology has been indelible. I spoke recently with Adriana Helbig, who is now a tenured professor in ethnomusicology at the University of Pittsburgh, and she affirmed this, telling me that without Mark, she doubts that she could have gotten her PhD focusing on Ukraine in the late 1990s. Mark's willingness to serve on her committee assuaged the fears of professors in the Columbia Music Department who had flatly told her that a Ukraine-focused topic would not be supported because it wasn't canonic enough. He was the voice, she said, that explained the region, its thorny relationship to imperial projects and civilizing missions, its murky status in the United States. His authoritative support allowed her dissertation to move forward and cleared the path for my own project, taken up nearly a decade later. Today, we are the two ethnomusicologists in the US with books published on Ukrainian topics that germinated under Mark's guidance. And I'll finally turn to Mark as a mentor. He was a skilled mentor, a voice of stability, supportive yet insightfully critical. He modeled how to survive and also thrive in the academy, as adept with institutional politics as he was with interpersonal politics, intellectually alive and perpetually learning, happy and secure in his home life with his loving husband. How does one learn to mentor, and in such a holistic way? For me, someone now in the privileged position of mentoring my own students, I mine the examples that have guided my career. Mark is my North Star for kindness. Mark is my North Star for kindness, that undervalued and desperately needed human resource. We know that he was certainly capable of bold argumentation and principled stances. We need look no further than his categorical recommendation to revoke Duranty's Pulitzer Prize in Journalism, or in the letter he shared with me in 2015, his private confrontation of Professor Stephen Cohen's pro-Putin position in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution. But he advanced the arts of critique in the most human of ways, never seeming to lose sight of the fact that there were people who advanced ideas and people who could revise them. We, especially those of us who get caught up in academic battles of the mind, could probably stand to be reminded of this more often, that we have a limitless resource at our disposal, one that augments rather than depletes, and it is the simple generosity of kindness. I am not ready to let go of Mark yet. So I will hold on to him. So I will hold on to him by striving to embody his generosity of kindness, his inexhaustible intellectual curiosity, that slightly subversive oompa he brought with him into the academy. I know that he lives on in me, and I would bet in many of us assembled here today. Thank you. Дякую, спасибо. Danke, Marko.
I was trained as a Russian imperial historian at Columbia from 1986 to 1995. I did not work with Mark. I was not one of his students in terms of my dissertation work, but I took one of his courses. Nevertheless, his presence was ubiquitous at the Harriman Institute when I was here. And he was also the faculty member among Russian historians who was the most accessible to graduate students, and there were many of us at the time. For example, when I initially went on the job market, not knowing how to write a cover letter or a CV, Mark was the one who came to me, shared his CV with me and his cover letters, no questions asked. There are a number of memories that I have of him from those years at Columbia that are sketched on my mind. The first is when the great Soviet dissident writer Andrei Sonevytsky came to give a series of talks here. And Mark was to stand next to him, and Mark had been given texts ahead of time, and Mark was to translate the texts. So he thought. And so 5 minutes before Sonevytsky started speaking, he turned to Mark and said, "I've completely changed my talk. I'm not going to talk about what's in that text. And so then Mark found himself, and Sonevytsky also was not giving Mark breaks to cut in and actually synchronically translate the way you're supposed to. And yet, Mark did a beautiful job. Nobody would have known. Of the Russianists I have known, Mark's spoken Russian was simply impeccable. Another memory I have, and I don't know if anyone else shares this, but to me this really was the epitome of Mark, and it's a strange memory, his years at the Harriman Institute, was that we had Russian historians at that time of perestroika and glasnost and fall of the Soviet Union. Every Friday we had a scholar coming in from some area of the world to give a presentation. And Mark would usually sit at the front of 1219 and introduce them. And for some reason, his chair was slightly behind the person who was presenting. And whenever the person who presented said something off the wall or something really controversial, Mark's very bushy eyebrows shot up. Maybe I'm the only one who has this memory, but for me, it was just, it became a way of sort of shorthand of talking about von Hagen, right? This humor, this kind of, ironic questioning of what was being discussed. The third, of course, which Maria so beautifully captured, was him playing the accordion at what I believe we, in politically incorrect language called Christmas parties back then, him playing the accordion, strolling for hours on end at the Harriman Institute. The accordion is incredibly heavy, and yet Mark, with his gargantuan height, at least from my perspective, just with total ease, strolled about. Now, the story I've been told about his accordion was that his Viennese mother introduced him to the accordion. And Mark's exposure, his interest in and his respect for other cultures, I think can in part be traced to his Viennese mother. Now, he did not grow up in a bilingual home, and yet he learned German at home. His brother, who's a couple years younger than him, does not speak German. Mark went out of his way, especially when his beloved Oma was around, to speak German to his mother and to his grandmother. Now, some of you here may question the decision that he made in 2007 to come to Arizona State University, where I had been teaching since 2000. And I think I have some insight into why he came, so I want to share that with you because I think it sheds light on Mark's character. One was that Mark was a Westerner from Denver. Unlike me, he did not, I think, become an adopted New Yorker. I don't think he fell in love with the city to the extent that I did. There was the convenience of having a car. There was the convenience of the weather, which was very good for his health and for his beloved husband's mood, one should say, since Johnny is from a very warm Puerto Rico. The convenience of the car, a lifelong love and desire that they had to have dogs. And those two dogs, Uno and Poco, whom they adopted from a shelter shortly after moving to Phoenix, are still with Johnny and are a remembrance of Mark. The beautiful house that they bought, which Johnny so eloquently furnished, their garden, their two patios back in the back and the front, which allowed for endless entertaining. And I have to say that I learned when we had a private memorial for Mark right after he died at their home, that when Mark and Johnny moved to the neighborhood, they sent out letters to all of their neighbors, informing them who they were and telling them to drop by. And through this gesture, which I don't think many people would do in Arizona, and in my native New England, nobody would do, they met all of their neighbors. And so you would go over to their house for these wonderful potluck parties and parties where they had ethnic cuisines of every country. Mark did find the best Chinese restaurant in Arizona, in the Phoenix area, as for those of you who remember the Chinese food dinners at his home in New York. Anyway, at these parties at their house, you would meet so many non-university people, so many interesting people, right? Mark was imbued with a very democratic ethos and egalitarianism, and one felt that in his socializing, the social milieu that he was able to maybe more easily cultivate in Arizona than he would here in New York City, living up in Columbia housing. I think the egalitarianism in him, the democratic spirit, also led him to accept Arizona State University's offer. Mark was very keen to teach non-traditional students and to teach students whose parents hadn't gone to college, who did not come from privileged backgrounds. And I know he very much enjoyed teaching at ASU. He especially liked working with our graduate students. There were many less than at Columbia, so he was able to spend one-on-one time with them, often having dinners and lunches one-on-one with them. And I have to say that our graduate students in Russian history are the most accomplished of any of the graduate students at ASU in the humanities. And I think in part his father's work as a public high school teacher also guided Mark in wanting to serve. Misha has spoken about his service ethos in wanting to work at a state university. At ASU, he brought his interest that garnered actually after I had left in team teaching. From what I understand, in Mark's last few years, he team taught with a number of faculty members, some of whom are here. They were Slavicists for the most part, though. So he comes to ASU. We don't have very many Slavicists outside of history. So he team taught with historians in other fields. He team taught a course on comparative colonialism with our Indonesianist. He team taught a course in war and revolution with our modern Japanese historian. And I have to say, looking back on my conversations with Mark from the 80s, Mark was into reading very broadly, into comparative and transnational history way before other Russianists became aware of this and became interested in doing so. He was always so well-read, always had something to suggest at any talk that he attended, books that were not within his field of research. Mark had a true gift for bringing people together. And for me personally, this didn't affect me personally, but in terms of the way I look at the field of Russian history, I think the most important contribution he made in terms of bringing people together were the numerous conferences that led to wonderful edited volumes, which he co-edited and co-edited with many of the people in this room. And those conferences broke the artificial divide between Soviet and post-Soviet historiography and Western historiography. And many of the young people from post-Soviet countries who participated in those conferences are now teaching at some of our top universities, as they should, and as we should look at a single historiography instead of one mired by Cold War animosities. Now, after he ceased being the director of our school, and a little bit more on how Mark came out to be chair of a history department and ended up head of a school in a minute, it has been mentioned that he became the founding director, and I don't think enough emphasis has been made on that, of this Office of Veteran and Military Academic Engagement, which actually after he died, I had to go talk to the woman who had worked with him on this because I never fully understood it. Now, I think many of you know that Mark was never at a loss for new ideas. He was a very creative thinker, right? And so always coming up with ideas, some of which came to fruition, some which didn't. But this one did. And this was the first such veterans center. There are now 2 more that have been initiated in the United States. It now has an undergraduate certificate program, a journal, biannual conferences, and within this program, Mark taught a course on America's recent wars. Now, about 10% of our 100,000 students are military or former military, and this course was just for veterans. And Mark used his interest in oral history, which grew even stronger towards the end of his life. He had half the students in the class interview the other half. Now, most of these veterans were male. They had a difficult time opening up and wanting to talk, especially talk about these horrific, at times, incidents that had happened in their life. But Mark, through his gentleness, through his kindness, was able to get them to do so. And really, I think that work was extremely important to him and would have gone on. In fact, he became friends with all of the Phoenix Veterans for Peace. Now, it is not a large group, as you can imagine. We're in Arizona. But they're a very active bunch, and every single time I went to Mark's house for a party, for a dinner party, they were there. In fact, they decided, after Mark died, to rename their group, and it is now the Mark von Hagen Veterans for Peace. Now, Mark was able to negotiate becoming the founding director of this new center in an environment that was not conducive to that, because Mark had run afoul of our extremely authoritarian administration the year after he came to Arizona State University. And that's because they brought him out to become the chair of the history department. They offered, they promised him 25 hires, and he was going to make it the best history department in the country. And then a year after he came, they abolished the history department, abolished the religious studies department, and abolished the philosophy department, and told him he was now director of the school of all three of these former disciplines, which he was then supposed to integrate into one major, one graduate program. Okay, this is again where Mark's democratic spirit came in. Now, he tried to fight. He fought valiantly. He was not going to win, because this was an extreme authoritarian administration, but he fought in such a way through diplomacy that he negotiated a very good deal for us, in that today, I still teach there, and we have history majors, we have a history PhD program, we kept our disciplines, we administratively, with a single overworked staff, were created and carved into a school. So he made some enemies along the way, and yet then, before I knew it, he had negotiated this new school and was off doing that, which again says something about extremely advanced social skills. Mark was a quintessential 19th century intellectual in many ways. He was charming, as we all know. He was even-tempered. He was eternally optimistic. And he had a deep appreciation and knowledge of high culture. Some of you know that he played in a chamber music quartet here at Columbia for many years. At the same time, Mark was inherently modern and social. There was a lack of pretentiousness about him. It's already been mentioned that all the graduate students called him Mark. I don't know why. We never would have called our other professors of Russian history by their first names. At ASU, all the graduate students called him Mark. They still call me Professor Manchester no matter what I tell them to do. There was something about him. He had an interest in human rights that was inherently modern. Yaroslav Ritsak has written that he thinks that one of the reasons why Mark became interested in Ukrainian studies was because the Ukrainians were the underdog and because he was gay. Now, one of the tremendous progressive changes that we've seen happen in this country, one of the few progressive changes in the last 2 decades, has been in gay rights. But when Mark first came to Columbia in 1985, he was told not to tell anyone he was gay, which shows you the different atmosphere and how this really was a human rights issue, and is still in many parts of the world, and hopefully won't be again in this country. He had an interest in Soviet dissidents and helping them. He was opposed to the Vietnam War, and as a high school student, he wrote articles about that in the newspaper. Even in his work with the Veterans Affairs Center, one of the issues that they were constantly tackling was whether the military was leading or following in issues of integration of minorities and women. Of anyone I have known, Mark had the strongest will to live. He loved life. He came back from the brink of death many times. He looked death right in the eye and simply refused to follow death down that path. He almost died 13 months before he did die. In August of 2018, he had ended up, after a whirlwind trip, in a Ukrainian hospital and was stuck there for a couple weeks. Now, I visited with him a few weeks later when he'd been released from the Mayo Clinic and was in a rehab center. And, of course, I had all sorts of questions about his health, which Mark didn't want to talk about. He weighed all of 101 pounds, and yet he wanted to talk about what he had learned about the Ukrainian health system. Mark had been an ethnographer as he had laid in this hospital in Ukraine, and he was full of energy, his intellectual curiosity, telling me all about how he'd have to buy the supplies and all of these different things that had gone on. Now, this hospitalization in Ukraine came after, it was an 8-day trip, meant to be an 8-day trip, hitting 2 cities in Germany, and then a conference in Lviv. And before Mark went, I tried to talk him out of it. I said, Mark, I'm healthy, I'm younger than you, there's no way I would survive that trip. Don't go. And so I was a bit angry with him, and I was angry over all the travel that he did, but now I understand. I understand that in order to live with the various illnesses he lived with for so long, he had to put on blinders. In order to live life to the fullest, and in order to professionally achieve as much as he had and to satiate that incredible intellectual curiosity, he had to simply act as if he was not ill, and I think that brought him many years. He never gave up. The day before he died, he was in the Mayo Clinic, and he asked Johnny to go home and get him clothes because he really believed he was going home the next day. My last couple of words are that I think the other reason that Mark lived as long as he lived was because of the enormous love that pervaded his life in his marriage to Johnny. In those 30 years, I have never seen 2 people so devoted to one another, and I think they have taught us an enormous lesson about love that we should all take with us. Спи спокойно, дорогой Марк.
So I recently wrote an article about Omelian Pritsak on the centennial of his birth, and it was called in a certain way the Harvard Chudo, the miracle at Harvard of the formation of the first chairs in the late 1960s and the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard that looked like it would be impossible to accomplish. But if we look back historically, many thought at that time that those chairs and studies should go to Columbia, which after all in the early 1950s was much in advance of Harvard in the study of Ukraine. But in a certain way, that Chudo was going to be put off at Columbia and was going to take place because of a number of members of the faculty here and the traditions of George Chevalov, but to a great degree because of the work of Mark von Hagen, who put Columbia on the map with Ukrainian studies at a time when Ukraine was being viewed anew and at a time when Ukrainians were able to view the world beyond them, perhaps for the first time in a long time, rather openly. Now, I became friends with Mark on a long train ride in the early 1990s from Kyiv to Kamenets-Podilsky. I remember it well because the trains were not heated and the doors kept flashing open and closed, banging the whole trip. I had convinced him to come to a conference in Kamenets on Polish-Ukrainian relations. And Mark being Mark, he took up, although he only knew me through a mutual friend, but took up this idea and invitation and joined on this journey. Parts of our journey were devoted to his explaining to me his view of revisionist historians. They were not terribly popular at Harvard, where I had come from, and learning a little bit more about the perspectives of Soviet history. But much of the trip was Mark discussing about, well, how this would be a whole new epoch of Polish-Ukrainian relations, that he saw how these two countries and their academic worlds could come together. I was a little bit more pessimistic. We arrived in Kamenets, and of course the fortress is what attracted a military historian as well. And Professor Piotr Ivanich, who was also at this conference, as we walked around the fortress, was holding Sienkiewicz's With Fire and Sword and reliving the battles of Skshetuski and those other figures of the 17th century. At that point, Mark broke out laughing and saying that perhaps it might take a little longer than he thought to have that rapprochement. But I think that tells us a lot about Mark. That is, always looking for the positive, always looking for a way forward, and always assuming that one could look anew at things that had been looked at for a very long time by other people. Indeed, I can remember that when first his Does Ukraine Have a History, so often mentioned, came out, obviously the title might be a little bit off-putting. There were those who wondered if the Slavic Review had, after all, had articles by Ivan Lysyak-Rudnitsky and Ivan Reshetar and Omelyan Pritsak in the 1960s in those nice volumes and discussions the Slavic Review put out. Why were we going back to this again? But I think Mark showed us there were many reasons to go back to it again. I would say the two major ones were he wanted to call a spade and say, whatever has been accomplished in Ukrainian studies outside of Ukraine until now has, whether you like to think of it or not, been done in a ghetto. And that it has not really reached out as far as you who indulge in it have really thought it did. And secondly, you must now deal with a nation state and look at national history and look at the history of a state in an entirely new intellectual atmosphere than you are used to from the 1960s. And unless you catch on to that, you are not really going to be able to communicate beyond your group. And that's what he brought, I think, to a great degree to our field. The other part of Mark was always that he wanted to reach out and learn new things and see new things. Well, now I think many of you are aware that New York has the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences, the Shevchenko Scientific Society, the beautiful Ukrainian Institute near the Metropolitan Art Museum. It earlier had the Ukrainian Art and Literary Club. Well, all those organizations existed, at least from the Second World War, but very few people from Columbia got from uptown to downtown, or else integrated them into these structures. In many ways, Mark was a person who wanted to reach out. Not that he did not see that there were the failings of the fortress mentality, which much of the Ukrainian diaspora had had until the Ukrainian independence, but because he could find something that would be of use there. He was never afraid to give his views. Mark was a proponent of federalism at times, and federalism, since the days that Drahomanov became not popular to overwhelmingly the Ukrainian diaspora and today in Ukraine, was not something that most Ukrainians responded to very positively. But he could put forth those views and put them within their historical context. That is, that federalism had been the dominant trend in Ukraine up until 1917, and those, however devoted to Ukrainian statehood after that might be, they could not then say that this was not part of their tradition. Above all, Mark also reached out to donors, and we mentioned that the funds that come to Columbia were very important in maintaining a Ukrainian studies program. Ukrainians in North America had become used to the idea that they were only going to enter academia if they could bring forth something very tangible to universities to become involved in. So therefore, there was a public, and Mr. Peter Yatsik, who had already funded Ukrainian studies at Columbia before Mark was active, and through time has been a major donor, responded very positively to Mark in many ways. But above all, that Mark was someone who took seriously the idea that he was going to become a Ukrainianist. He was going to learn to speak the language. That is something that even many Ukrainians in Ukraine were not doing in much of the 1990s. And that placed Mark, I think, in an ideal position to speak to a Ukrainian community in diaspora that might hold very, very different views than he had. But that kind of seriousness, I think, brought much fruit. Mark was such an optimist that in the early 1990s, we began a series of meetings, conferences called the Russian-Ukrainian Encounter, funded by NEH through the Columbia proposal, with the Humboldt Stiftung and our colleague Andreas Kappeler in Köln, attempts to look anew at the Ukrainian and Russian past. Once again, Mark was extremely positive on where we would go with this project. It did not go as well as we hoped. That is, many colleagues in many fields were more open than historians were to looking anew at Russian-Ukrainian affairs. Everything takes a little time to germinate. But just by beginning those discussions, and by publishing the material that he published, and I urge you to look at the Harriman review of the contemporary Ukrainian discussion, where Mark puts out his agenda, and you will see how deeply he had thought of why this was an important endeavor. By 2002, the Ukrainian Instruction Fund was formed here at the Harriman Institute to promote teaching in Ukrainian studies. And Mark was involved with this, and I at times would come down to teach. And together, perhaps after a few drinks, we engendered an idea for a course that we would teach a course on Ukrainian-Russian, I wouldn't say relations, but mutuality, contacts, in which we would begin with the present and go back into the past, and that I would give all the lectures on Russia and Mark would give all the lectures on Ukraine. We never really got the reports from students on how much learning went on, but the two professors learned a great deal and enjoyed what they did at that course. It was the kind of thing that Mark would respond to something new and trying it new in every way. He was a wonderful president of the International Association of Ukrainian Studies, and of course this also was one of those benchmarks. Someone not of Ukrainian background becomes the head of this association. Not only becomes the head of this association, but with the able help of Maria Sonevytsky, plans a conference in 2005, and remember Ukrainian history. We're just going after 2004 and the turmoil, or one of the periodic Ukrainian revolutions, and to do it in Donetsk, a city which still at the point when we arrived in Donetsk, the rector of the university could not receive us unless first the head of the Oblast administration gave permission for us to be on that territory. Mark went wholeheartedly into the organization of that conference and even brought the president of the director of the university here to New York in a way of bridging the gaps that we had. He was involved, of course, in the issue of the Ukrainian famine and the Pulitzer Prize, the periodic attempts of the Ukrainian community to get it taken away from Mr. Duranty, a very complicated issue. But it was wonderful to have someone with Mark's new eye to look at those problems. And of course, he did that very much at the Ukrainian Free University, an institution, after all, by now, formed in 1921, one of the oldest private universities in Europe, and certainly one which has spent more time outside its homeland since it was formed at that time. Mark also brought that to the Ukrainian German Historical Commission. We were both on an advisory board, and here I have to say as well, there were times when I wanted to say, Mark, just don't come this time. Stay home, rest up. Tell me what you have to say. I'll try and pass that on to the commission. But he was dedicated to it. But above all, he found his opening towards Ukrainian studies an intellectual journey that he wanted to take. That intellectual journey involved his interest in military history. It dealt with the issue of borderlands. And it above all dealt with military and war as two separate, I think, components, and how they affected the changes that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century that were going to really remake Ukrainian, and not only Ukrainian history, but of course Russian imperial history, Russian history, and the histories around. Mark could always look with new eyes at things. He picked up John Reshetar's book from 1952, which somehow had been left out of whatever training he had gotten as a Soviet historian, and said, how come this book is not reprinted by now? Which I thought was a way to evaluate both to say, I didn't know this, and now I want other people to know it. And that's why he was a great teacher, because his goal was to say, if this is my interest and I have found it, I want to tell you about it, and I want you to tell others about it. And so that book, which for some of us was getting dust on its shelf, could be pulled out anew. But I think most markedly, Mark looked at Pavlo Krystyuk, a writer of a huge chronicle on the Ukrainian Revolution, which had been translated at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies long ago when Bogdan Kravchenko and various people of the left were at the Institute, and had never been published. Said, this must be published. He did all of the work of the references for it. He wrote an introduction for Pavlo Krystyuk. We sent it out to reviewers. He saw the reviews of that introduction, and we are going to put that out. That book that he wants to get out so that his colleagues, both in Russian history or traditional Russian studies, might look a little bit new at what went on in Ukraine. But just as much that those people who are caught into Ukrainian studies, which rather prefers people more conservative or more statist in their attitudes, also would look anew and understand Krystyuk. I might add that the Lipinski Institute, a monarchist foundation, was funding the publication of this because it had such great belief in Mark. And it showed how he could bridge all kinds of political gaps even within our community. Before I came here, I pulled out the one, I think, tense time I had with him is when he adopted Eurasianism as his catchword for how we were going to redo our field. And I must say, I was a stick in the mud and still bound in the old Eurasianists whom I found were not people that I wanted to see the name of restored, and also, like many people in what we called, after Oskar Halecki, East Central Europe, were much more interested in the European dimension of the Western borderlands than in any greater Eurasian entity. As well, we also had, after all, the memories of Trubetskoy and not entirely positive visions of where Ukraine belonged on the map. I urge you to go to the American Historical Review and read that article. There is so much erudition in it. There are so many tendencies, new schools of historiography, new ways he wanted his Eurasian concept to fit. All of those I much agree to. But I'm still glad that his Eurasianism didn't win out as a concept, so we could vary in those ways. But most of all, I, like all of you, am going to miss him. Miss the calls, the meetings, the new ideas, the ways in which he always cared about what the other person was doing and thinking. And that's what made him such a wonderful colleague. He also, of course, had a wonderful family life for which we are all very grateful. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm going to speak about Mark in the first years of his teaching. That's when I knew him best. We sort of lost touch later in his career. My memories are fragmentary and impressionistic, but they all show Mark in action as an agent of what was new, inviting, and invigorating in those years. I arrived at Columbia in the fall of 1988. It represented a major turn in my own life It coincided with the earth-shaking events in Russia. Perestroika had begun, leading to the lifting of my non grata status and making it possible for me to visit the Soviet Union. Russia had begun to become exciting again. The closed system was coming apart, the academic world more open, the ferment that would lead to the creative upsurge and tumult of the 1990s, the sense that new things could happen, new vistas, popular democracy, possibilities of a different world. What the anthropologist Victor Turner called a sense of communitas in primitive societies, feelings of unstructured belonging and equality of community, replacing the state-imposed inequality of communism. Mark very much embodied the spirit of communitas, the collective vitality, and with it, and he had a flair for it. With Mark Ryev and Leopold Haemsen, Columbia was still a leader in the field of Russian history, but as Michael indicated, the two of them were not talking to each other. The mood was not very good. And Mark came in and remedied all of this ill will. And he brought fresh changes. First, his appointment was to teach Soviet history, which marked a sharp break from the previous decades and the avoidance of the study, which had been justified by the inability to use icons. Mark brought the history of the Soviet Union back into the purview of the history department. Second, he introduced a new perspective on Russia and the Soviet Union. He stood apart and above, as Michael pointed out, apart and above the politicized debates of the Cold War and its aftermath. The breakup of the Soviet Union awakened our historical profession to what should have been obvious already, that Russia was an empire and encompassed numerous nationalities. The previous focus here had been on the political and social history of Russia, and I, no less than others, was a product of that orientation. Indeed, though Columbia had courses on nationality taught by Professor Edward Allworth, these subjects were marginalized and almost ignored. Mark not only took up the new emphasis, he quickly became one of its leading proponents in the United States and abroad, and most importantly, he did so with a feeling of contagious enthusiasm and inclusiveness, which I think everybody on this panel had felt. His size, clever smile, and natural warmth infused his intellectual mission with a spirit of friendship. Mark joined the common effort of the 1990s. He generated a sense of communitas and created his own community, or communities, very quickly. I experienced this on my arrival in 1988 when I was a senior professor and he was a beginning assistant professor. He was the first one to invite me to dinner and later to lively parties at his and Johnny's apartment around large bowls of paella. And that was lots of fun. I think Johnny will agree with that. He was, as everyone has pointed out, he was the high point of the Christmas parties, where wearing a rubashka, playing the accordion, he led us singing his sighs and sweep were part of this, a smiling giant with the gift of immediately making you feel that you're one of the most important people in his life. We both were runners, and I remember the many hours we ran together in Riverside Park, sharing ideas and, of course, gossip, making clear that we were involved as friends and scholars in a common cause. It was a curious sight, Mark's towering figure hustling beside me with my diminutive height. On occasion, Kathy Popkin joined us, so we had a threesome ranging into the distant reaches of Riverside and Central Park. He invited me to join his seminar on empire and nationalities, and we taught together for many years, reviewing the literature, considering new approaches to the broadening theme of the Russian Empire. He conveyed a powerful sense of discovery and mission, and I too began writing articles on the subject. His inclusiveness involved Professors and graduate students beyond Columbia and in different specialities such as Russian literature and, as we see, music, as well as comparative studies of empire, while engaging the most recent methodological approaches. He extended his enthusiasm to Ukraine, as we've heard, where he helped organize an International Society of Ukrainian Historians that worked to advance the history of the Ukraine with publications and improved access to archives. He became president of the society, an American, the head of the Society of Ukrainian Historians, and I jokingly always compared him to the coming of the Varangians, who were invited to Russia in the 9th century to come and rule over us. And Mark filled that role very well. And his single-mindedness inspired such leadership even among numerous Russian and European institutions. His rise was rapid and his message defined. I particularly remember him, one clear memory of mine, at a conference in the city of Kazan in 1994, staged with great flair and resourcefulness by my colleagues Boris Kasparov and Catherine Yevtukhov. It was part of a program to extend the range of scholarly meetings beyond the major centers and bring provincial scholars into the discourse. I recall the trip to Kazan when we occupied an entire car of a train guarded by an MVD officer. The trip down there, of course, was riotous, lots of drinking, some singing. Elizabeth Valkenier and I scandalously occupied a single compartment. Mark's arrival was delayed. I don't know why, but it was not even certain that he would appear before the end of the conference. Most striking was the reaction of younger scholars, both American and foreign, who eagerly awaited him, asking all the time when and whether he would appear. It was abundantly clear even at this early stage that he was a figure of international standing whose words on the subject of empire and nationalities were eagerly weighted. At last he arrived. He presented his critique of the conventional focus on the nation-state, which he placed in a comparative international perspective. After reviewing some of the literature on the Austrian and Russian Empire and critiquing the tendency to view the Russian Empire as a nation-state in embryo, he presented his own alternative, namely an order of communities, quote, a sensitivity to the diversity and contingency, but not arbitrariness, of religious, ethnic, ethno-religious, political, and social communities. He envisioned a federalist organization, a state reflecting the spirit of popular democracy of the 1990s, bringing the government closer to the people. Mark expressed his faith in group action and practiced his own leadership in organizing conferences, Sporniki, which he saw coming to the fore with the breakdown of authority in Russia. It was a counterpart to his own modus operandi, uniting followers around him through ideals and a common spirit. He continued to pursue his interest in federalist solutions at international meetings and in writings. The diaries of his visit to Ukraine showed him at his best. They described his meetings in cafes, the friendship and brotherhood of artists, writers, and musicians, his admiration for the unrealized culture of a democratic Ukraine. Mark's federalism was an extension of his devotion to the group, his sense of warmth and comradeliness that made him such an effective leader. He exercised this force in his dynamic leadership as a director of the Harriman Institute, as chair and leader of departmental reform of the history department here, and later in trying to build the department at Arizona State University. But both in the latter cases, here in Arizona State, his efforts met with their limit when he had to confront authority, namely university administrations less susceptible to the allurements of charm and common ideals. For me, the loss of Mark von Hagen is one more reminder of the loss of the hope and vitality of a distant era in our common life. Thank you.
Hi. One amendment I would like to make to, excuse me, could I have a glass? Not, I hate to drink out of, well, anyway, if there's a cup around, I would enjoy it, otherwise, too proletarian, excuse me. But anyway, one amendment I would like to make to Richard's talk was about our trip to Kazan in this, lest you have some imagination, you imagine some orgies going on in that car. Nothing could have happened because those were the usually open cars, you know, open. So if you entered at one end, you could see to the other. And then there were very uncomfortable wooden banks. So, anyway, it wasn't inducive to romance or anything of that sort. Not at all. But anyway, just to add something. Well, as far as Mark and our celebration, thank you for the water. And our celebration or our tribute to him is concerned, I would like to add or emphasize in my talk that he was one of the most complete persons I've ever met. And by complete, I mean a person who was not just a scholar and a teacher, but a marvelous human being and a loyal friend. And that is something one doesn't meet that often. And I'll always have that, and I still have that image of Mark as an example of a complete person. And since I knew him, of course, he was a colleague, so I knew him as a scholar and appreciated his work and made use of his work in some of my my own teaching. I still knew him best as a friend, so I would like to comment on that aspect of his personality. Well, I met him probably at the very beginning of his arrival at Columbia in 1988, because as other people have already mentioned, he was a most hospitable person and had very frequent meetings or soirees or вечеринки, I suppose we should say, in his house right here next to Columbia on Morningside Drive. And we lived, and my late husband and I lived also on Morningside Drive, so we used to meet each other, not just at the Harriman Institute, but also at our homes. And in addition to that, Mark and Johnny were generous, as usual, to invite us to their home in Puerto Rico. And both my late husband and I still remember, or I still remember, the warmth, not just the warm climate and the lush, the tropical nature, but the warmth of family life that permeated the atmosphere in their home. And they built themselves, they added an extra floor to the family house where we could sort of look on the beautiful garden around and all that. I still remember bougainvillea, first time I saw it in my life. But anyway, I would also like to mention how easy it was to become friends with Mark. Well, first of all, his looks were very attractive, I must admit. Well, he was tall, slim, and in those days, well, he was clean-shaven, and I apologize to all of you who are not clean-shaven, but anyway, just to differentiate from these images, and which, well, in my own home, I have his pictures of when he was 100% good-looking, let's put it this way. Well, but of course, I mean, to be on a more serious side, I should emphasize that what made him such an all-around, completely attractive personality were not just his looks. Personally, complete person, but obviously not his looks, but his personality, which was generous to an extreme, and we've heard enough about that. And he was also modest, he was optimistic, he was a loyal friend and dedicated to his teaching, and he was also fun-loving, and he really enjoyed life in all its aspects. I mean, here we see him with dogs, and I can appreciate that especially. You know, it's like gives you an extra dimension into one's generosity if you can share it with our four-legged friend, so to speak. And so it included, so his enjoyment of life, and I might mention it, included not just love for people, love for dogs, but also enjoying occasionally, as far as I knew, marijuana. He introduced us, maybe one shouldn't mention it, but anyway. Why not? And anyway, we didn't turn into habitual users, my husband, late husband and I, but anyway, it was an interesting experiment, but anyway, it's another dimension of life, not necessarily academic, but well, and I would like to say a few more words about his generosity, and it was really extraordinary. Well, for example, I mean, one of the earliest examples I had of it was his disagreement with the history department rather early in his career, and which contributed to other problems and eventually probably facilitated his moving on to Arizona. He stood up for the rights of the students, or the comfort of students, and wanted some locker space for them, to create some locker space so that they wouldn't have to drag all their equipment, electronic and otherwise, all day long. And of course it met with, not of course, but anyway, it did meet with a cold shoulder or a negative attitude from the department, and I don't know what the other details of disagreements were, but that certainly was one of them, and demonstrated that, after all, it would have been easy enough for Mark not to pursue the interests or the rights of students to have extra comfort, but to acquiesce, but he didn't, and then insisted, and one disagreement led to another. As far as his honesty or lack of pretension, I think is a better way to put it, is concerned, I can think of no better example than his resigning from the Council on Foreign Relations, an elite institution here in New York City on Park Avenue and all that, which counted, former ambassadors, Wall Street moguls, and some scholars. It certainly looked very well on his CV to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, but after about a year's or maybe year membership, he found these meetings rather uninteresting and banal. And I could attest to it because I worked at the council for 8 years or 10, I forget. But anyway, and sometimes I listened. In those days, women were not members, so I had to hide behind some bookcases to listen to actually a seminar that Henry Roberts conducted, and I really found them very uninteresting. But anyway, so I appreciated, at least I condoned Mark's resigning from the council, but it was a certain amount. It took a principled attitude because membership obviously added to one's prestige. And as far as professional standards, well, others have spoken of it, but I think that part of another example of Mark's high standing as a honest, principled professional, honest is a bad word, but anyway, as an honest professional was the fact that the publishers turned to, and journalists turned to Mark to comment on Duranty's falsification of Soviet history. In other words, the fact that Duranty had, in his reports on Ukraine in the 1930s, completely omitted mentioning the terrible famine that took place. And I mean, it really is a criminal offense for any honest person, and especially a journalist. Then, but I can't read my own writing. Oh yes, that I benefit, as far as my own benefit of association with Mark was not, being friends and being befriended by an exceptionally fine person, but also I benefited from his advice, and I'm forever grateful for it. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, if I have my dates correctly, so did the topic of my teaching, because I was teaching Soviet relations with the Third World, a very hot topic and a topic of contention and rivalry between the two superpowers. So I was teaching Soviet relations with the Third World, but it became a non-topic. And at that time, Mark, knowing that I had written my dissertation on a group of Russian painters at the end from the end of the 19th century, namely the Peredvishniki, suggested that I take a year off and prepare a course on the history of Russian art. So I took a year off, plus the fellowship, and taught that course to my great satisfaction, and I hope to the satisfaction of my students as well. I taught it for about 10 years, and I owe that to Mark's concern and generosity and so on. So what can I say in conclusion? That, the best tribute I can pay to Mark is that, in my horizon of models and find people who, inspire me and make me feel good about humanity and history and so on. The other person I can compare Mark with is that of Philip Mosley, who was one of the founders of the Harriman Institute way back the Russian Institute, and before we got the money, but it was a very well-known institute just the same without the money. Well, no, I shouldn't laugh at my own jokes, but anyway. But it's you are guilty. Well, Mark, so now I wanted to compare Mark to Moseley, and Moseley was just such a, well, I really can't find proper words right now because I can't read my own writing. But Moseley was a very principled person and such a dedicated professional teacher and scholar, and the good example of his dedication and utter and not concern for his career and advancement was the fact that at one point the president at that time, maybe it was Johnson, invited Moseley for a seminar on Soviet-American relations to be held in Washington, or a conference. And Moseley said no. Can you imagine anybody these days say that? Well, I would have a difficult time. Or, well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, Moseley said no. Why? Because he was teaching a seminar. Well, it's easy enough to compare to postpone a seminar, but Moseley did not. And because teaching came first to him. So, I mean, this is the same is true of, Mark as a person, as a scholar, and as a friend. And I'm missing him very much. And this is a nice.
I don't want you to trip over.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm falling apart. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now would invite members of the audience, Mark's friends, colleagues, if you have any memories you'd like to share yourself, if you have any questions for our panelists, we have a roving microphone, so just wait for the microphone to come to you, and if you just say who you are, that would be great too. Yes, please, Sysyn.
I'm Sysyn Human, or Herman. I don't know if I count myself as one of Mark's closest friends, but I remember telling him in 1985 when I met him, and I was already finished with my graduate work, that I was glad he was there because we needed something to smooth the waters, because it was. But a few years ago, I got a call from Mark out of the clear blue sky, and I still am trying to digest the whole thing. It was he wanted to talk to me about the work I did with soldiers. Now, I hadn't spoken to him probably in 15 years, I don't know, more than that. And I must have told him that I was teaching in the 1 year, I started teaching in 1969, which is the year that there was no lottery system. And so I had all these people, and I was teaching in the Bronx, so mostly not white students, and they were frightened that they were going to be the first to be drafted because there was no lottery system. And it turned out, later I found out that the same was true at Columbia, that there were professors trying to protect the students at Columbia. Anyway, Mark asked me, he must have remembered a conversation we had. So out of the clear blue sky, we met at one of the conferences, the annual conferences, and had a whole several-hour conversation about soldiers and about how we worked with soldiers. And I confessed that I had taken an entire class of European history students to a court-martial at Fort Dix, and he drank this up. And I never forgot the fact that what a memory this man had, because we hadn't talked about it probably in more than 15 years, probably 20 years. He was a remarkable, warm human being, and I'm glad that he was able to work with veterans and to do all this. It was something very important to them and to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to ask a question? Yes, please.
One of the things that was really amazing about Mark was the way he took in people. And you've all spoken so well, but Steve Kotkin was here earlier, and he and I were both sort of loners in our cohort. We didn't have big graduate cohorts. And in 86, 87, 88, I came to Columbia and was able to join the Columbia Mafia, the younger graduate students, and Mark took me in, and Mark became a mentor, a friend, through a very tough year. My father was very ill that year and then passed away, and Mark was the first one to call me when he saw the obituary in the paper. And, that's the thing about Mark, was that he always noticed what was going on for every person. Every ACES meeting, every conference, we would get together, we would talk, we would catch up, and that feeling that somebody said it, you were always the most important person when he was talking to you, and I don't know how he did that, but I just am grateful that we can all share that wonderful sense of what a really amazing scholar and mentor and friend he was. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please.
Nathaniel Knight, I teach at Seton Hall University, and I was part of that original cohort of graduate students that Mark first taught in his early years. And of course, it was not an easy position to be in, triangulating between these great giants in the field. But I want to talk a little bit about his style as a teacher, which I've been thinking about more since he passed. When we first got here, we all went into his seminar on Russian historiography, Soviet historiography. And of course, there have been numerous mentions of how polarized the field was at this time, the debates between the revisionists, the totalitarianists, and how easy it would be to fall into one of those categories and direct an introduction of graduate students to the field in accordance with that. And that's not what I remember at all. What I remember is him giving a broad sweep and showing us the landscape, introducing us to the different figures, and teaching us that whatever we think, whatever position we take, we have to understand the ideas, we have to respect the ideas, understand how they differ from one another before we start to put people in one pile or another. So, we would read, treat Martin Melia seriously, Leszek Kolakowski, treat him seriously, read Stephen Cohen, treat him seriously, understand the ideas. He was also my first experience as a teacher. I was his graduate student for his Soviet history course. And actually, I remember when Elizabeth came and spoke to the class and gave a guest lecture, and it was my first experience giving a guest lecture to the class. And I guess the thing I remember from that class was how he took what would have been the ordinary standard introduction to Soviet history class and made it come alive by enriching it. Not only did he give wonderful substantive lectures, but he brought music into the class. He sent me out to give a lecture on Russian art, which I didn't know much about. And it was a wonderful learning experience to me and showing all of these great pictures. He brought in poetry. He had students reading Mayakovsky, and so it was a holistic experience that went far beyond what the ordinary survey course would have been, and it was a wonderful model for me as a beginning teacher to have that as something to aspire to and emulate in my future career. So a lot more I could say, but I'll leave it at that.
Please.
I'm Karina Snyder, and Mark was on my dissertation committee, and always an incredible advocate for me. Maria and I met years later, not knowing, and it was our love for him that actually, I think, sparked our friendship. So I want to speak to this, the ability of Mark to bring people together. Just that you both knew him meant that, there was something special about you. But I also I'm probably one of many people who, like Maria, My specialty was Lithuania in the early 90s. So you can imagine how many anthropology of the Baltics colleagues I had in the globe. And I was particularly not coming at it from a nationalist perspective, so that also limited the field. And Mark was so incredibly generous to take me on as scholar with nobody to work with, honestly, in my field. And he stretched himself, as you pointed out with music, into ethnography. I wrote a very personal ethnography, and Mark went with it and commented on it critically and gently in a discipline that wasn't his, in an area that wasn't his, in a time period that wasn't his. And I feel incredibly grateful to have had that experience with him, and I'm sure there are many, many, many other students like me who had that.
Thanks so much. Anna?
Not much, but right about how warm he was. When I first met him, I was here as instructor of one course in Polish, and once we stood on the same line to the cashier in the drugstore on 111, right, or 10, and Broadway. And of course, I would never talk to him because he was a professor and so on. And he started to talk to me. And for me, it was such an experience, such a warm experience of meeting a person who is friendly, who is a professor and talks to me. And later, we met and talk on many occasions, but whenever I cross that corner, I still stand with him in that line.
Thank you so much. Jane?
I'm Jane Burbank. I'm so glad that Elizabeth mentioned how utterly charming Mark was and how handsome he appeared to all of us. I met Mark when he was a graduate student, and I think I was still a graduate student as well, and it was at Stanford at the Hoover Archive. And I still remember this wonderful, charming man, and thinking, as we've all noticed, he's always focusing just on you, and thinking, well, he's flirting with me. But alas, alas, not the case. We became very good friends and colleagues, and I'm one of the people that wrote with Mark. And I have co-authored with other people, including people in this room, and I just want to say that Mark was a wonderful person to write with. He made it very easy to write together. But the point I'd like to make about Mark for this gathering is how much of a mentor, guide, and supporter he was of young scholars from the ex-Soviet countries. And we worked together in the mid-90s. We were both part of what I think of the American missionary efforts to supposedly teach Russian and other ex-Soviet scholars how to do history. Now, we were invited to be in summer schools where the American professors were supposed to be teaching Russian something. Well, both Mark and I agreed that this was nonsense, that we were working together with wonderful young historians, and that they should be in charge of many of our projects. And that was the origin of the book that Mark and I and Anatoly Vremenov ended up editing together, in which there were articles written by Ukrainians, Russians, Americans, Germans, and so on. And, but I want to mention, in connection with this book, it was fun. And Mark was the person that made it fun. We, in working together on this book, ended up having conferences at Samara, Omsk, taking a boat on the Volga. The final editing work on the book turned out to be on a boat on the Volga. And one of my fondest memories, maybe somewhat painful, of Mark is tramping around in the Siberian steppe with the collection of authors on this book. And as it turned out, Mark was not only attractive to human beings, but also to mosquitoes. And while the rest of us were jumping into lakes and trying to cool off, poor Mark was there, absolutely swollen, red with mosquito bites, but nonetheless having a great time and making all of us feel wonderful together.
Thank you so much. Please, Johnny.
I'm going to try to say something. First, it has been wonderful to see so many people that I haven't seen for a long time. And I want to say thank you for all the kind words that you say about him. I just want to read a little something that it will let you know what it meant to me. He was my north, my south, my east, my west, my working week, and my Sunday rest, my moon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. Thanks.
So friends, we do have, as Mark would have wanted us to have, a reception outside ready to go where I invite everyone to share your own memories, most importantly, connect and reconnect with one another. I'd like to thank Michael, I'd like to thank Maria, Laurie, Frank, Dick, and Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the panelists. Johnny, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, Mark, for all your gifts that we'll keep and we'll be sure to pass on. Thank you all.